Hi, and welcome to Living and Learning. I'm Karen Kugel, your host, and today we're going to talk about something that a lot of us think we know a lot about, housing, because we live in houses and we also live in communities, but actually there's a lot more to it than you think. So I have with us today an expert guest, and our guest is going to talk to us about housing, community development, what's happening with it today, a little bit about the past, and how his dedication in his career really dovetails with all of these things. So I think it's going to be a really exciting session. So I'm happy to have and introduce to you today Doug Cook, who is an appraiser, a community development planner, an expert in the field. And I'm not going to say any more about his career. I'm going to get you right into the topic to tell us how you got into this field in the first place, Doug.
Well, first, thank you, Karen, for inviting me. I'm going to enjoy the opportunity to talk about something I'm very passionate about, housing and community development, which also happens to be my career. So I think I originally got interested in the field in high school. I had a history teacher who taught us through various methods, but made us focus on how historical activities, how they were created and how they developed based on an economic analysis, a social analysis, and also a political analysis. And so I became interested in also what the communities, how they were affected. So I thought I would study sociology. I went to a college and that was going to be my major, sociology, and I found it was too academic. So I decided I was going to transfer to another college. I couldn't find a college or a university that really reflected what I wanted to learn, and then I studied this thing called community development. And there were two universities in the entire country. One happened to be my home university, where you're also an alum, Rutgers University. And the community development program was in the Livingston College campus, which was a more diverse campus. It was across the river from Rutgers. After I graduated Rutgers, I decided, what was I going to do now? I was thinking I would either go into VISTA, which was the domestic sort of Peace Corps, and I also applied to graduate schools, and the only graduate school that accepted me was a Harvard Graduate School Design with a concentration in city planning. So I spent 2 years in Cambridge, as I guess you did too,
also there.
In postgraduate years.
Double alums.
Yeah, postgraduate years. And for me, it was an eye-opener. Just any university system. I had the ability to go to the Kennedy School and learn on the Kennedy School of Government. I took classes in the business school. I took classes in the college. I had a unique interest in, it was actually called at the time a ghetto development course, which was at MIT, and I was able to take that course. So I was able to learn also the fundamentals. Again, economic analysis, environmental analysis, policy analysis, understanding how communities were structured. There was also a design perspective, a city design perspective at GSD. And it just was a real great way to kick off my career, and then also being in the Boston area. And I've been here for 40 years since then, and it's been a very valuable and enriching experience, obviously. So when I graduated, I decided I was going to go work in the Boston area, and I worked for the Fenway Project Area Committee. And that was an urban renewal area, the Fenway was. It was at the tail end of the urban renewal area, of the urban renewal development. And there were 4 more sites that still need to be developed in the Fenway. And 2 essentially executive directors before me had really created a great environment with community participation and also a technical analysis, the two going together. So they created a great precedent for me to be able to continue that. And we actually chose the last 4 developers for the Fenway, which was quite an experience for me coming right out of graduate school. And so my next transition was to go into the private sector. And I worked for the Boston Financial Group, which is still around today in a different name. But they are a financial intermediary that focuses on affordable housing investment. At the time, they were actually worked in conventional multifamily housing and also some commercial development that they would help finance or syndicate. And I had, the part of the business that I was involved in was the underwriting. So I learned how to do appraisals, I learned how to do market studies. I had to go out into the community. I was the eyes for the company, for instance. I would go out into the community, interview developers, interview other apartment complexes, spend time with the city planner, understand how the community would work and gather the data. This is before Google, obviously, and before available databases. And again, that was...
That is amazing when you think about it.
Yes,
the kind of
it was.
legwork you had to do.
Back then, you'd get credit just for getting the information. Now you don't get credit for getting the information. It's what you do with it. But that was a very valuable experience, and I was there for 10 years, and I became a partner. And the thing that was different in my career than maybe someone else who may be focused in city planning was I actually had to do presentations to the investment committee. So my presentations would consist of a technical presentation talking about the community, talking about how the property would rent up, talking about what the rents could be achieved, the expenses that were necessary. And then after I became a partner, I actually had a vote. So unlike a lot of people that do appraisals or do community analysis, I actually had to decide how to make an investment, whether that investment should be made. And it's a different perspective that you bring to that. Mm-hmm. And after I left Boston Financial, I received my member of the Appraisal Institute, an MAI. Mm-hmm. So I was officially designated as an appraiser. That took me about 5 years to learn how to do that. And that was when I started sort of melding my profession. I worked for a while as a fee appraiser generally, and that wasn't interested to me. I got back into community development, affordable housing, when I helped create Cushman & Wakefield, the global real estate company, yeah. Cushman & Wakefield's Affordable Housing Group. And I was responsible, I was the national director, for managing about 15 other appraisers across the country, from San Jose to New York City to Miami. And we were doing appraisals, market studies, and consulting for individual developments and for pension funds and so forth. Again, that gave me the opportunity to go across the nation. And if you want, maybe we could look at Figure 1, which shows a map, and it identifies where I've done a lot of my work. From 1997 to 2010, actually, I have listed here over 1,000 developments that I've studied. I either did appraisals on, underrating, yes.
It's impressive.
That was back in the day when you used to have to spend 2 to 3 days in each community to do that work. And over 46 states, about 200 metropolitan areas or rural counties. And a tremendous experience because I got to see the variation across America. And believe me, folks, this country is very diverse. One of the things I do want to mention is I've always felt everyone was hospitable, no matter where I went. And I think that would still be true today. So after I spent time at Cushman & Wakefield, I also spent the last 10 years of my career working actually with accounting firms. In the last accounting firm I worked for, I was the only one who had different letters after his name. I had MAI instead of CPA. And what I did there was I did due diligence for investments in affordable housing. So I was taking everything I had learned over the last 35 years and then using it to help investors who were making these investments. And my analysis is not on the accounting side or deep into the number side, although I do that analysis, but it's really on the real estate side. It's really on understanding the community and how the property fits in, what its market position is. And that is something that's valuable in our industry now because in affordable housing, and we'll talk about this in a bit more, it's very much a 3P, public-private partnership profession. And there's individual investors involved with government investment.
So that's great. I was just going to ask you, what of the things that you've done, what was the most fun part? if you can even identify. You said that the people that you meet were very hospitable. I was just kind of curious. So what are some of the fun things that you did?
Challenging question because I often was involved in training appraisers or other people, and in the training process you have to teach them how to gather the data, how to analyze the data, maybe how to do the field work, and then how to write and piece together a report. I actually found all of that interesting.
You like the mix?
Yes, it is. As I get a little older and a little more mature and in a senior position, the write-up part is actually a little more tedious. But I think like a lot of people, I found the write-up part was when you would help to synthesize your thoughts and bring them together. So I guess the most satisfying part was when you're finished, you've come to a conclusion, and the conclusion is accepted by your client, or in the case of deciding on an investment, that you've helped bring that investment together in a successful way. And again, we're influencing how that investment decision gets made. So we're talking about how the numbers work, is it feasible? And we're also talking about how it fits in with the community in terms of long-term sustainability.
Got it. Okay. So taking that into account, can you tell us more about how we got to where we are today in the housing market and this whole issue of affordable housing, private-public partnerships, those 3 Ps? Tell us about that.
Okay. Deep history?
You don't have to go too deep.
Okay.
It's up to you.
I'll be quick. But it's sort of on the top of your head, and this comes both from planning and understanding affordable housing. I'd say probably around the turn of the 20th century. 1900s, when we saw the Reform Act, the antitrust busting activity, more progressive movement. It also filtered down into the cities where people were making settlement houses. We saw the high density and the squalid conditions that a lot of people lived in. It really brought about a lot of reform. The new tenement law was passed in New York City, which would create more light and so forth. And then I say the public.
Excuse me. What create more light? What do you mean?
I'm talking about an individual building.
Oh, okay.
Create more light in individual buildings, in tenements.
Was. Yeah.
Yes.
I have to go back.
Much more natural,
days.
natural light. Yes.
Right.
But the federal government first really jumped in the 1937 Housing Act, which we understand as the beginning of public housing, which was supposed to be a transition housing. It was supposed to be for folks who were temporarily low income, temporarily would need a transition point to get into their own housing situation. As it progressed, we saw, as we came closer into the 40s and the post-war era, and all the servicemen and servicewomen were coming back, we had a big housing shortage. So they combined the Housing Act with also building housing for veterans, but also the 1949 Urban Renewal Act. And for that, we should be looking at figure number 2, help me sort of describe a little bit more some of the things that were happening in urban renewal and what it sort of manifested, how it manifested itself. So we'll see when you look at figure 2, on the left side is St. Louis in 1952. When we look at the right side, it's St. Louis in 2013. So basically it's before and after urban renewal. On the left side, you'll see contiguous blocks with contiguous buildings. Density, yes. And I think if you got down to the lower level, perhaps you would see it would look a little squalid, maybe a little disheveled, maybe not completely clean and well painted. But in that community, very often there was a lot of social cohesion, especially back in the 50s and the 40s. Neighbors would take care of themselves. They knew where their children were playing. People would walk other people's children to school. There was a social cohesion. When someone needed some coverage for going to a PTA meeting or going to work, you would get help. And that's that sort of density effect that helps do that. The picture on the right, you'll notice the Gateway Arch. And you'll see the bridge coming over from the Mississippi River, and you look a little bit up and you'll start to see a lot of vacant parcels. You did the demolition, you did the renewal, you did the removal, you created highways, but you lost a lot of those linkages. We've come a lot further since that time. Another thing that this picture, and this is why I chose this, in the original picture, in the 1952 picture, you see a cleared area, and I've indicated that's where Pruitt-Igoe is. And for anyone knowledgeable about public housing, that is a notorious housing development that was demolished 30 years after it was built. It was that typical project that we all hear about. The next Housing Act was 1968. The 1968 Housing Act more or less privatized housing. So now private developers could do development that would serve low-income households. And it was done through either rental subsidies or mortgage subsidies. Also in 1968, we had the 1968 Fair Housing Act, which is also very important, especially on the private investment side. Prior to 1968, you could have almost legal redlining, which means you could isolate communities and say, this community is low income. In fact, in some cases, it's minority. Therefore, banks don't have to invest there. So in a short space of about 5 years, we reversed it, and we had the Community Reinvestment Act, which said banks have to invest in these areas. So that was a real watershed period. In 1974, the 1974 Housing and Community Development Act was created. That created Section 8, which we all know as a privatized housing situation where there's a rental assistance to the tenants. It also created the Community Development Block Grant Program, which is still alive today and was the major funding sources for communities across the country.
Can I stop you for a moment there? Only because I wanted to just reflect on what you were talking about. You did a great job bringing us through the different phases, and it seems like every, 5 or 6 years, some major thing happened related to housing. And I was thinking of how the turn of the century, in the early part of the century, a lot of that probably had to do with the amazing immigration that we had to accommodate that and the industrial growth in our country. And then you had the post-war era, and then the other kind of a mix of private investment and public investment, and how are we going to shape out these really growing communities during the baby boomer times, if you think about it. And now, you talk about Section 8. What I want to understand, and maybe our audience too, is when you talk about affordable housing, how do you determine what is affordable? What are those categories that determine income level versus what it costs to rent or live in that area? Can you talk about those metrics? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Actually, that's a segue to the next Housing
Act.
Oh,
good, okay.
Which is the 1986 Tax Reform Act, actually, which eliminated a lot of the tax incentives that were provided to investors and developers who wanted to build housing which could be affordable, including housing for the 68 Affordable Housing Act. It created the Low Income Housing Tax Credit Act. Mm-hmm. And in low income housing tax credits, the threshold, you are allocated a low income housing tax credit to do a development, and the threshold is 60% of area median family income.
I see.
So I'm just going to glance at my notes to this so I get it right. The median family income, or the area median family income in Boston right now, in the Boston Metro, is $107,000. 60% of area median income is $64,000 for a family of 4. So a family of 4 who earns $64,000 can live in tax credit housing.
I see. That's perfect. Thank you. That's what I really wanted to understand. Mm-hmm.
And when we'll talk about workforce housing a little bit.
Right.
That may be 80% of median family income, and it may be 100% of median family income, which I said was $107,000. But at 80%, it's about $81,000 in the Boston area. So I was talking about the tax credit program. Mm-hmm. And that came about in the Reagan era. And what's interesting is, I don't know if your audience is familiar with the low-income housing tax credit program, and it's okay if they're not, because it's one of the least controversial programs in the government right now. It's a a program that's more or less administered by the IRS because it's a tax credit. And the biggest regulatory incentive we have, which comes down through the enforcement through attorneys and accountants, is that if the project fails, it may have tax recapture, which means you may lose the entire investment. And so you have the IRS looking over your shoulder, and because of that reason, the foreclosure rate, for instance, and we'll talk about this a bit more, is under 1%.
Wow.
So it's really a very safe investment. In community development, something else that came about in 2000 was the New Markets Tax Credit Program. I won't delve deeply into that, but it's a way to leverage public dollars for private dollars. And for every $1 of federal investment in New Markets Tax Credit projects, we get $9 of private investment. It's a pretty good ratio. So
That's excellent.
if we could also now look at figure 3, that'll show us current market dynamics. And in that, I try to compare conventional housing market with the affordable housing market to talk a little bit more about what some of the differences are. And you don't have to become an expert on these graphs or anything, just keep an eye on the slopes. In figure 3, if you look at the graph on the top left, you'll see the line on the top represents conventional multifamily delinquencies, and the line on the bottom, which stays sort of static, that's orange, that represents low-income housing tax credit foreclosures, which, as I just said, is below 1%. In the peak of the recession, multifamily foreclosures got up to 4%.
So in 2008 time frame,
Yes.
basically? Yeah.
Yes. The graph on the bottom left shows building permits, the orange line representing tax credit building permits, which is usually steady around 80 to 70,000 units a year. And the top line is all multifamily building permits, which is ranged from 180,000 to, in the low of the recession period, 70,000. So you see how steady sort of the trend line is for affordable housing. Even in the depths of the recession, we were continued to able to build.
Well, can I ask one question there?
Yes.
When you talked about the housing permits and you mentioned the amount, you said something like 170,000 versus
Units.
Units. So those are the units at that time, but they went down to what you said, something like 70,000 at a certain
70,000.
point? Yeah,
Yes,
so that's
during the
precipitous.
recession.
So that explains why we had the difficulties within the construction industry and people getting
Exactly.
jobs and the
Exactly.
banking and everything else, all of the other products that would, and businesses that would come
Right.
into play there. Yeah.
And
I
the
see.
low-income housing tax credit program is definitely a private-public partnership. You have investors, which could be financial institutions and banks and so forth, will invest in the credit. You have private developers who apply to the states, state housing finance agencies, to get an allocation, either through bonds or a direct allocation, tax-exempt bonds or a direct allocation. And then you have the community involved. You also have a big nonprofit area, both financial intermediaries that are nonprofits and community development corporations or community developers that will be doing tax credit developments.
So can you talk more about that, the the private-public partnerships and the community development part?
Absolutely. Circle back to a little of the history lesson. In the 1980s, I'd say, beginning of the 1980s, actually the 1970s, the Ford Foundation, the Low Income Services Support Corporation, and a number of government and philanthropy interests decided that we should find a way to solve the problems of the city. And one of the things that came out of that whole effort was community development corporations. To this day, I think we have about 2,000 community development corporations. And so it may be people, in fact, when I was involved in the Fenway, the same people that went into the Fenway CDC were the same people that were protesting some of the things going on in the urban renewal era. So Now, instead of just being activists, they were being community developers. And when you're involved in a community development or affordable housing development nowadays, we spend a lot of time with the community. In fact, for our developments, we will spend time proactively knocking on doors of neighbors, both housing and business owners. We will call community meetings on our own accord in a hotel room, for instance, and try to gather people and get an understanding of what their development is. So there's that outreach that occurs on the development side. And then there's always a city agency that's involved. In Boston, it used to be the Boston Redevelopment Authority. In other cities, it be the Community Development Department. They may designate certain areas for reinvestment. And so as a developer, you may go in and ask a city, where do you want to see some activity? Or maybe a developer or maybe a community may have a developer that lives in their area, and they may ask them, they may proactively say, we're interested in you doing this development in this area. And then the developer is responsible for gathering the resources, some public, some private.
I see. So bringing that all together to where we are today, what are some of the solutions that are offered through housing and community development with our current difficulties with still finding affordable housing for a lot of the population?
You mean besides just building?
Right, besides building, and actually, I guess I want to understand this. Where does things like, maybe even when you were living in Cambridge, rent control, where does that come into play?
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about some of the more innovative things that are being done. We talked about public housing. Public housing was 100% for low-income people. We've come full circle now. In most situations in cities, we want to encourage mixed income housing. I remember back in early in my career, the Mass Housing Finance Agency had done a study that mixed income housing works. That's almost considered a given in our industry now. So that means it's not just low income, it's moderate income people, it's higher income people. And there's a lot of social research out there that actually says mixing the incomes helps for everyone. It helps lift up lower income people so they can see what can be attained. It helps higher income people understand how other people live. And you also asked...
and the workforce, or people who live and work in the community, that they actually have the ability to potentially live and work in their community as opposed to commuting a great distance.
Right.
As well. Yeah.
Right. So workforce housing, again, it would be teachers, firemen, it would be policemen, people who work in your local retail store. They may earn a little more than 60% of median family income. What we're actually doing, the company I'm working with, we're actually trying to create more housing that gravitates between the 60 and 80% area, because there's nothing new built for those folks. And placing them next to where there's a lot of high employment is very necessary in order to have the sort of economic development or the return to some growth we want to see in cities.
I see. No, that's great. So I think what I want to talk about now is go back to looking at your career. And there's so many, from what you've said, so many touch points of finance, a little bit of accounting, community development, town politics, building, construction. There's so many different, design, the other part, the urban planning part. Can you talk about if someone were interested in this career, as you've had, such a diverse levels of expertise along the way, how would a person approach that today who might be interested in this career?
Definitely multidisciplined.
Okay.
I started out by saying history. My history teacher emphasized social, economic, political. So good dose of policy analysis, political science, understanding the environment, studying sociology, studying community development per se as it gets applied. In both my professions, American Planning Association and the Appraisal Institute, they both emphasize social, economic, governmental, and environmental analysis. The Appraisal Institute talks about the characteristics of real estate districts, which is just a euphemism for neighborhoods or market areas. And the APA also talks about the same concentration. But what I've also done, if I've gone one step further, and I would suggest this for those in your audience thinking of a career, I've spent a lot of time in professionalism. So I got my designation as an American Institute of Certified Planners. I got my designation with the Appraisal Institute. And in cases of affordable housing where there wasn't a designation for doing market studies, I actually helped create an organization called the National Council of Housing Market Analysts. And we created standards and best practices and also an ethical standard and a designation. Well, not a designation, a sort of a certification process. And to those three organizations that I belong to, I do 48 hours of continuing education a year. And so you got to keep it up. For instance, maybe we close here. I mean, the thing now is to build more energy efficient, green, both in the APA and also in my Appraisal Institute courses. I've taken some courses in green now.
Right.
So that's something more current. There's always something new to learn about the built environment or about how communities are evolving.
Right. So if there was one take-home message, as no pun intended, we're talking about housing, but if there was one take-home for our audience about your career and this whole area of housing and community development, what might that be?
Well, it's a very satisfying career. For one thing, you can have an impact. I had an impact on my first year in the business. I was jogging early on Westland Avenue in the Fenway, which had a lot of vacant housing at the time. And I saw a bunch of people in suits gathering, and no one gathered with suits early in the morning in the Fenway in
At that time?
1979, yes.
Very different now.
Very long story short, affordable housing development replaced some of the vacated housing. So you can have an impact very early on. You can put the pieces together. And also it's a satisfying career because you can do both impacting the communities, and on the private side, you can do the feasibility analysis, which creates a sustainable investment, which then reinforces the sustainability of the community to continue.
That's amazing. It's awesome. Well, Doug, I hope that you continue on this path in this work because it is so rewarding, and it's so important to all of us to have good, solid housing and also communities that we can all thrive in, all around the country. Now, we talked about Boston, but I know you've worked elsewhere. So thank you so much for being our guest. I hope we can dig a little bit deeper into some other areas of community development in another session. We want to have you back for that.
Okay.
So thank you again.
Thank you.
Thank you, audience, too, for joining in. We hope you found that really interesting. Thanks. We'll see you next time.